My name is Samhar Johannes, and I, along with my colleagues Emily Cullen, Susan Graham, and Jasmine Shoemaker, we run the Spotlight Guest Instructor Workshop Series. In this series, we invite university community members and friends to share their research and creative endeavors in a one-hour talk hosted in the library or virtually. Due to the ongoing success of the Spotlight series, we have expanded our parameters to create a semester-long themed symposium every fall semester. This fall semester-long symposium, titled Prison State, aims to explore the regional and pervasive impact of prison incarceration in Maryland. The inspiration for the theme comes from the library's special collections prison-related materials, as well as the gallery's exhibit being hosted titled Prison Nation. Today's speaker is Dr. Michael Casiano. Michael is an assistant professor of American Studies and a core faculty member in the Public Humanities minor. Currently, he's completing his book manuscript, which is titled Let Us Alone, Race and Police Power in Baltimore, 1857 to 1929. This talk draws on this book's key sources and arguments. His presentation today is titled Policing Jim Crow Baltimore, Policing Jim Crow Baltimore Archival Insights. And with that, I'll turn it over to our speaker.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? Great. I'm going to share my screen. Is everybody seeing the presentation? Okay, perfect. Cool. So 1 hour talk. Cool. More like 40-minute talk with time for questions. So yeah, the title of my talk, Policing Jim Crow Baltimore Archival Insights. I decided to pull a slight audible, and cater the talk to the election yesterday, because there were some pretty momentous ballot questions and other sort of constitutional amendments that passed. So given yesterday's election, I've decided to cater this talk to some of the historical legacies of these changes, particularly the legalization, specifically the possession of narcotic drugs, which I'll talk about the latter half of this presentation, and the charter amendment that returns the Baltimore Police Department to local control for the first time in a century and a half. And on the bottom right here, you'll see one of the returns in 1920 for one of these referendums. Consistently has been the case that these referendums fail, and there's a particular racial legacy to that, which we could explore in the Q&A. So specifically for this talk, I'll discuss how the racialization of crime and political and social life led to the increased criminalization of Black men and women in Jim Crow Baltimore during the 20th century. I'll discuss how this racialization animated government reform movements, drug enforcement, and broader theories regarding Black men and women's presumed adaptability to urban life. And ultimately, I argue that this criminalization drove broader agendas to articulate and frame the duties, affordances, and powers of the municipal corporation, or what carceral theorists call the police power. The story begins, and this is relevant, with an extremely consequential election, the election of 1895. So before I dive in, this was an interesting artifact that I found while I was rooting through Charles Bonaparte's personal papers, of which there are way too many. But this is an election sample ballot from the 1895 election, which was like in tatters, and I had to sort of piece together and scan. And you can see the socialist labor ticket, which I've always found interesting. I'm doing a little bit of research on that too. So why was this election so important? So on October 30th, 1895, 6 days before the 1895 election, Roger Cull, the chairman of the Reform League, sent instructions to all his election day watchers. Your business at the polls on election day will be to watch the conduct of the police and, as far as possible from outside the poll room, the conduct of election officials. You are to respectfully but firmly insist upon the police discharging their duty of arresting offenders when committed by any judge of election, and their duty of arresting all persons who shall commit or attempt to commit any election offense in their presence. After several months of organizing ward clubs, protesting election judge appointments, strategizing over new legislation, and raising hell in the press, the time had finally come for these reformers, spearheaded by Colin and a few others, which we'll talk about, to knock the political bosses of Baltimore's democratic machine off their pedestals. The Baltimore police proved to be the last line of defense for the intensely unpopular machine. This unpopularity stemmed from the collective organizing of an elite group of reformers who hoped to swing the city and state government over to the Republicans. Since the 1870s, Baltimore's democratic machine controlled local politics. The so-called ring coordinated political alliances, exploited the spoil system, and exercised broad influence over the Baltimore police. The ring's bosses included Arthur P. Gorman, see here on the left, a politician who rose through the ranks of Maryland politics and eventually became a U.S. Senator. Isaac Freeman Raisin, seen in the middle there, the secretive boss who exercised control from his relatively obscure position as clerk of the Court of Common Pleas. And J. Frederick Talbot, an ex-Confederate U.S. congressman who was the chief sort of general in Baltimore County. So to knock off this entrenched political grouping, a reformer class emerged during the 1880s. Their emergence coincided with national currents in urban reform as sentimental white Puritans sought to reorganize and professionalize inefficient city governments. In Baltimore, Charles J. Bonaparte, seen there in the middle, embodied the movement. Bonaparte, a devout Catholic with time and money to spare, viewed the failures of urban government through interlocking religious, ethical, and political prisons. He viewed the saloon, the brothel, and other sites of popular leisure as integral for the consolidation of the ring's political power. Through ward level organizer, the ring secured loyalty through promises of police protection for saloon keepers, brothel owners, and bookies. In exchange, ward bosses intimidated Republican voters, installed Democratic election judges, and ensured the election for the ring. And if you're wondering, yes, it is that Bonaparte. He's the grandnephew of Napoleon, and his grandfather was Jerome Bonaparte, who was Napoleon's brother, and his grandmother was Elizabeth Patterson, daughter of William Patterson, the very famous and wealthy merchant. Given this loose yet efficient network, Bonaparte and his allies established several reform organizations to destroy the ring and construct a city in their own image. Bonaparte either helped found or served in an executive capacity in all these groups, including the Reform League, a group that oversaw election fairness. On the right there, you see Roger Cole, who was the vice president of the Reform League. The Charity Organization Society, which is a poverty relief organization. Charities during the sort of late 19th century presaged what we now call social work. The Baltimore chapter of the Society for the Suppression of Vice, a group that pursued the enforcement of public morals. Anthony Comstock's organization. On the left there, you see John C. Rose, who was the general counsel for that association. The Civil Service Reform Association, a group that lobbied for efficiency in local and state government agencies, and the Good Government Club, a network of ward-level groups that challenged election abuses at local precincts. Following national urban models, these organizations grew and subsisted through the patronage and donations of wealthy people. And sort of this status of warring rich white factions was of particular criticism for working class Black people and the Black political class more broadly construed in Baltimore City. Of this sort of confrontation, the Afro wrote, "The reformers rave against bosses, but there is not a more tyrannical class of dictators in American politics than they. Their idea of reform rises no higher than a desire to dictate not the method of appointment of office, but the appointees themselves. Should this silk-stocking aristocracy ever control the government, the appointees will be rich men's sons and college graduates only." The Black press had plenty of critiques for the ring and the silk-stocking aristocracy that challenged it. They viewed this power struggle as a lose-lose. Ring control would perpetuate police violence and segregationist efforts in public conveyances and civil life. Reformer control would prove paltry and largely superficial. Black participation in urban government while fundamentally leaving Black life unaltered, that is to say, extremely vulnerable to political and physical abuse. Ultimately, the late 19th century power struggle that dominated city politics hinged on the city's Black residents. While typically loyal to the Republicans and thus the reformers, Black Baltimoreans became increasingly disaffected as the regulation of Black life dominated political discourse. Nationally, crime became affixed to Blackness in criminological and sociological literatures. The election of 1895 and its aftermath echoed these broader currents in intensely local detail. Specifically, Black electoral participation created a stir before and during the election that spoke to broader white paranoia regarding Black crime and political power. And so one example of this includes this sort of conspiracy. So in early October, Roger Cull caught wind of a Democratic conspiracy to commit election fraud through the deputization of Black gangs. William Jubb, a Black man, owned and operated a saloon in South Baltimore. Evidently, an unnamed and unidentified man witnessed a curiosity at Jubb's saloon. Several Black men, later identified as members of the Meadow Gang, entered Jubb's establishment. A white man, who was later identified as John F. Ahern, a clerk who kept guard of the voter registration books at the Superior Court, met the gang members on the second floor of the saloon. Ahern allegedly gave each man a card with the name of a registered Black Republican. The men committed each name to memory and went to the precincts in which the voters were registered. They falsely represented themselves to the election judges as the registered Republican and asked that they be re-registered at a precinct on the other side of town. After the judges entered these changes, Ahern, the clerk, recorded them in the registration books. While the story, if true, constituted a gross election abuse, it was transparently ludicrous. From what I can glean from people's correspondence on the issue, it was like, I heard from a guy who saw a guy who was watching the saloon, and maybe we saw the clerk enter the saloon. But for the most part, it was totally unsubstantiated. There were no witnesses who could credibly attest that Ahern, a high-ranking clerk who had access to the registration books, participated in this conspiracy. And I'm keenly aware that this does smack of a lot of like stop the steal contemporary discourse. The reformers knew that the story was bogus. However, the League also knew that such abuses did happen, even if this one may not have. Given the difficulty of proving such activity, however, they opted to target Ahern and the Black men to publicize the practice. In letters to Roger Cull and Joseph Packard, Bonaparte ordered his on-the-ground generals to have Ahern arrested. Given the election's proximity, Bonaparte felt that mass meetings and confrontational editorials had lost their fervor. You see here from the excerpt from a communication that he sent to, or from a letter that he sent to Roger Cull, he writes, "The mere fact of his arrest will have a far greater effect on the healer element than any number of statements in the papers, and I think we have reached a stage of the campaign when statements and counter statements have, in great measure, lost their force." So they were trying to create a public spectacle and trying at the same time to deputize the police in this broader sort of movement against the democratic machine. Given the election's proximity, Bonaparte felt that mass meetings and confrontational editorials had lost their fervor, as he says. To truly discredit the ring and shock white voters, the public needed to witness a more severe action. Ahern's arrest and the spotlight on the ring's use of Black men, particularly Black gang members, in coordinating fraud would make any potential legal consequences worthwhile. Bonaparte expected Ahern to post bail and never reach trial. On October 30th, the criminal court issued a bench warrant for John Ahern's arrest. They also issued warrants for William Jubb and Bob Davis, who was the leader of the Meadow Gang. The Meadow also, as a side note, referred to a community in West Baltimore, like a smaller neighborhood. The police arrested all three that day. As Bonaparte expected, they posted bail and the grand jury tossed their cases. It did not matter, though. The stir revealed a malicious and contemptible election practice. The editors of The Sun, you can see on the top left there, eviscerated the ring for employing so-called quote unquote sable henchmen. These henchmen operated local boozing and gambling haunts. They received protection from Democratic ward bosses in exchange for help on election day. They packed pistols and staged violent skirmishes at the polls to scare away voters, or so the story went. For the Sun, the white voting public should be disgusted, which you can see right there, by the ring for providing legal cover for small-time black criminals. Though Bonaparte, given his relatively positive relationships with the black electorate, did not likely intend for such a condemnatory discourse to emerge from the debacle, he gladly took the anti-machine press that came with it. So now with this scandal sort of shrouding the election, the ring was firmly on its back foot. And Call organized his army of watchers, and that led to rumors which began circulating that the cops would obstruct their ability to patrol the polls by keeping watchers out of the poll rooms. Additionally, the Reform League organized to stamp out an age-old custom. In the days leading to the election, several hundred repeaters were cooped in saloons and lodging houses. These poor men came via train from surrounding cities, including Philadelphia, Wilmington, Norfolk, York, and Hanover. They slept on pool tables and rolls of carpets on street corners. In exchange for cash and booze, they stormed and battled precincts to cast votes for ring candidates. The Sun speculated that the unprecedented volume of repeaters in town meant that Gorman and Raisin knew their days were numbered. The Reform League and its agents had shadowed the ring's recruiters and tracked the repeaters' arrivals. As a side note, the rumor is that Edgar Allan Poe died because of this practice. That they found him like drunk with delirium tremens or whatever it's called, and he had been being shepherded around Baltimore, forced to vote. On election day itself, ring toughs or healers intimidated, beat, or shot several men, including black voters and Reform League watchers. In one instance, a healer whipped a black voter in the back of the head with a belt. A group of white men descended on the man and kicked and punched him. In another case, a group of black men arrived at a precinct to vote. A white crowd surrounded them. From out of the crowd, a gunshot pierced a black voter's leg. The black men fled with the white healers in tow, who fired errant shots into the air. Despite all the chaos, the police marshal held firm that the election had been peaceful. The reformers' collective will, organizing, and resources paid off under the cunning leadership of Bonaparte, the unshakable resolve of Cull, and the courage of a battered black electorate. The Republican Party swept the election. They won the governorship, the mayoralty, and 25 of the 33 contested city council seats. Absolutely decimated the machine, if only for a couple of years. Following the win, the Reform League's leadership turned its attention toward the police. Call found their comportment reprehensible during the election. He accused patrolmen of obstructing watchers from following repeaters at the polls, and he attacked the police board for instructing police to hinder watchers. We're going to do a little bit of a time jump, but after the Republicans sweep the election, they use their power, particularly their power on the city council, to eliminate, as the Afro had suspected, all of the appointees who were currently in power. And so that included the police commissioners, that included the police marshal who was fired, that included several station house captains, that included a lot of rank and file patrolmen. And they did so by sort of publicizing police corruption in the sort of protection of gambling, which was this open secret that nobody really cared about, frankly. They also passed legislation in the General Assembly to reorganize the police board and make it so that there was a member of the minority party on the police board. And this is when we still had a three-person police board before we had one sole police commissioner. And so they continue to chip away at the sort of democratic stranglehold on the police, while at the same time trying to force the policing of things that the democratic machine did not care about, including brothels and saloons and bed houses and all these sort of local haunts of public leisure. And so that leads to a very hyper racialized discourse during the 1898 midterms, and then also in the 1900 general election, where Democrats weaponized the sort of Republican permissiveness of Black life as a way of regaining control over the city. So on October 28th, 1901, this is after now Democrats are back in control, Alonzo J. Miles, counsel to the police board, delivered an impassioned address before a packed audience at Hollins Hall. The meeting came on the heels of continued reformer organizing against the police, again firmly under Democratic rule. After the Democratic resumption of power in the 1900 general election, reformers continued publicizing political and police corruption in a never-ending fight in the court of public opinion. Baltimore Herald published a front-page story entitled, "How the Police Are Helping the Machine." The story alleged that patrolmen following ring orders were arresting, quote unquote, quote, arresting colored men upon the slightest provocation and very frequently without cause, end quote. Reformers charged that most of these spurious arrests occurred in districts with significant Black voting populations during voter registration. To combat such accusation, Democrats refocused the conversation to centralize the identity of the victims. At this mass meeting, Democrats dug their heels in on the subject of quote unquote Negro rowdyism. John Prentice Poe, an attorney and Democratic loyalist who would later draft and fight for the passage of a Black disenfranchisement measure in 1905, said, quote, "We must rise to the height of the occasion and resolve that the government of the state must remain in the hands of the white men of the state," end quote. Alonzo Miles, during his fervent public address, extolled the virtues of the Democratic Police Board and criticized the supposed alarming criminality that flourished under Republican stewardship and all of the changes that they had instituted. For Miles, the current police board inherited a panoply of human degradation masquerading as a city. Booze corrupted innocent white women, brothels and bedhouses enticed fornicators and destroyed property values, young people shook their rumps and ordered interracial dance halls, drug use proliferated among Chinese, Black, and foreign-born residents, and the new confounded moving pictures washed over a population of impressionable dopes. He didn't write that, I paraphrase that. The ministerial union thanked the police board for, quote, its efforts to enforce the laws touching the morality of the community, end quote. While appealing to the moral character of the current police board undercut Republican claims of amorality, Miles's most forceful evidence against the allegations of political cronyism and malfeasance came through a comprehensive statistical comparison between the police board under Democratic and Republican control. Which board had done a better job of policing Black men and women became the question for this election and the question for subsequent elections. For Miles, quote, Republican speakers and newspapers tell you that the talk of Negro rowdyism by the Democrats is a bugaboo intended and designed to prejudice the white man against the Negro for political purposes, end quote. However, for Miles and the Democratic machine, based on the rates of Black arrests under Democratic and Republican leadership, two things became obvious. First, Black crime and its menace to good morals and property were real and not embellished by Democrats for brazen political purposes. Second, Republicans were far too permissive in stamping out the rising tide of Black crime that would undoubtedly culminate in ruinous outcomes for the city. To prove these theses, Miles juxtaposed arrest statistics under two governors, Democrat Frank Brown and his successor, Republican Lloyd Lowndes. In a bizarre development that undermined his argument, when aggregated, the number of Black arrests under Democratic leadership was 27,930. Under Republican leadership, the figure was 34,175, indicating that Republicans, in fact, criminalized and arrested Black people more than Democrats. And this was also one piece of a source of frustration that Black Baltimoreans had with the Republican Party, which was that they voted with the party of Lincoln because there was this sort of chance to sort of progress politically within the party. But when Republicans resumed power, they overcompensated in these very public ways. And oftentimes, Black Baltimoreans experience, I mean, it wasn't better or worse. It was all horrible, but really bad treatment under the Republican-controlled police board. So Miles spun these figures, however, by presenting the increase in Black arrests under Republican leadership as the emboldening of the Black criminal class. He argued, quote, The Negroes of Baltimore City became so much more bold, defiant, and impudent while their masters were in charge that Negro rowdyism increased to such an extent that 17 more of them were arrested every day of the Republican administration than there were under the Democratic regime, end quote. He further evidenced this claim by relying on anecdotal accounts published by various dailies in which the papers condemned Black people, particularly Black male youth, for indiscriminately hurling insults at white women and making them feel terror at the prospect of walking alone in public. Not coincidentally, the Sun ran Miles's front page tirade next to a provocative and doom-laden editorial entitled, "Shall the Negro Rule?" The story began with a quote from George T. Winston, former president of the University of Texas, who assessed that Black Americans had become friendless in both the northern and southern United States. According to Winston, quote, "The North, tired of Negro politicians and Negro beggars, is beginning to say, we have helped the Negro enough, let him now help himself and work out his own salvation. The South, worn out with strife over the Negro and supporting with difficulty its awful burden of Negro ignorance, inefficiency, and criminality, is beginning to ask whether the race is really capable of development or is a curse and a hindrance in the way of Southern progress and civilization," end quote. The editors heartily agreed with Winston's assessment, going so far as to claim that Black and white Americans were closer together during enslavement and that a single generation of freedom had almost destroyed Black people in the US. The editors condemned Republican demagogues for advocating Black suffrage and for betraying, quote, "their white friends and neighbors to gain political reward," end quote. For the editors, Black people were incapable of exercising the freedoms associated with civil life because they were a quote unquote child race that had to be, quote, "developed under the tutelage and control both socially and politically of the whites," end quote. To facilitate this process, the paper's editors urged Black people to repair their sullied relationship in the city by fully withdrawing from politics. Such an action was imperative if Black people were to escape, quote unquote, annihilation. This partisan battle for municipal control of the police raged on during an uncertain period in Baltimore. As municipal factions vied for power and influence, party leaders stoked the flames of racial division by citing persistent myths, predicting cataclysmic racial annihilation, and romanticizing the horrors of enslavement. Opponents framed Black criminality or rowdyism by recounting dubious stories about Black men's supposed intimidation of white women on public streets. This invocation conjured several widespread myths that structured interracial relations during the period, including the supposed hypersexuality of Black men that was generally illustrated through fabricated charges of rapes committed against white women and the alarming conditions of everyday interracial exchanges that stoked fears of miscegenation and justified increased public order policing and segregationist measures. Complementing this alarmist characterization of Black life, the Sun's editorial board relied on pseudo-empirical data to forward the notion that enslavement had actually been a constructive experience for Black people because it suppressed their supposed childlike inducements toward vice and criminality. What emerged after these 5 years was a city with newfound power and a tense political battle. A home rule charter, which was passed in 1898, juiced the city's ability to operate more autonomously while still retaining questions between state and city sovereignty. Democrats retook control of local government, but sadly acquiesced to some reformer demands. They assumed a largely superficial investment in moral evenness, at least enough to keep the reformers at bay. At the same time, they appeased the white public by cracking down on a constructed wave of Black criminality. At the turn of the century, Black crime became the key issue facing Baltimore City. Segregationists railed against the depreciating effects of Black residents, police railed against the unmanageability of Black people, and reformers railed against Black men and women's supposed incapacity to exist in the city. After such discourses gripped Baltimore and directed police operations into preventive policing in interethnic neighborhoods, drug use began to dominate political debates and justify the bugaboo of so-called Negro rowdyism. So the early 20th century continued the wave of institutional rejections that men of influence exercised to replace inefficient city functions with newer, sufficiently punitive modes of controlling working class Black men and women. While social reformers advocated for pragmatic policies to root out corruption, malfeasance, and excess in urban government, the courts and cops looked for new legal avenues to exercise home rule and satisfy a citizenry that demanded continuity, management, and reliability, two goals that often contentiously overlapped. The old way simply could not keep pace with rapid urbanization and calls to safeguard class and racial hierarchies in developing cities. Well-to-do Baltimoreans clamored for crime mitigation, contra the slipshod and garbled systems of local government that Bonaparte and his ilk fought to reform during the late 19th century. The turn of the century heralded higher bureaucratic aspirations and demands for legal protections against social ills that well-to-do citizens found repugnant, including interethnic cohabitation, interracial sex, prostitution, liquor, and drug use. On the latter issue, police rode a wave of moral drug panic to justify invasive policing strategies and provide the illusion of comprehensive enforcement. While the press peddled stories about drug use that made it seem as though a cocaine epidemic gripped the city, drug consumption was a relatively mild concern compared to other substance-based crimes, such as public drunkenness. The police's own records showed few drug-related arrests, yet and still, newspapers burst at the seams with stories about black drug dealers, black coke addiction, and the corrupting influence of black drug use on foreign-born whites. News stories on coke's medical and physiological effects express the nature of drug use in markedly social rather than medical ways. These slippery prognoses invoke the dangers of black unmanageability or attributed black unrest to cocaine use. Such ideological diagnoses were not unique to Baltimore. In 1906, Atlanta sent a dispatch to the Sun, the Atlanta paper, and the editors recounted how the city's race riot that year could in part be attributed, quote, to the remarkable increase of the cocaine habit among Negroes, end quote. Since cocaine was a relatively new drug with few commonly understood attributes, the press, physicians, and law enforcement took pains to characterize coke as a black drug, a substance that somehow unleashed black crime. The Sun boldly opined that the drug was, quote, the direct cause of much of the current lawlessness among the colored people, end quote. In the early stages of panic over cocaine's psychoactive effects, so-called eminent specialists in nervous and mental diseases noted that, quote, much of the insanity and nervous derangement prevalent is noticeably due to the drug habit, and crime is often directly traceable to the impulse, end quote. Prevailing discourses filter the connection between crime, insanity, and cocaine through a prism of racialized and gendered assumptions. During the period, Black women in particular were understood and represented as being particularly susceptible to victimization of via cocaine use. The press continued to push the Common Sense Party line of Negro rowdyism that casts white men as pious. The present wave of immoral and vicious criminal behavior fueled by ruinous cocaine habit, which had infected an impressionable and incapable Black populace and their foreign-born cohabitants. To combat this perception, Sherlock Swan, grandson of Thomas Swan, the mayor who signed the ordinance that created the Baltimore police, drafted an ordinance intended to stamp out the cocaine evil once and for all. Popularly called Swan's Cocaine Ordinance, the law made it illegal for any person or entity to, quote, sell, furnish, give away, or have in his, her, their, or its possession, end quote, any regulated narcotic. The ordinance penalized drug possession for the first time in Maryland. Alarmist stories, theories, and reports accompanied its passage. Black men and women had become symbols of dysfunction, addiction, and gross indulgence. They simply could not handle the freedom of the city and resorted to drugs and booze to cope. Or so the story went. Despite voluminous yellow journalism on this front, over the next 3 years, as this law was being instituted, police arrested 81 people under the new law. Of these, 72 or 89% were men and 60% were white. These statistics countered popularly disseminated theories that Black people, particularly Black women, had fallen victim to cocaine use in alarming numbers. One story in the lead up to the passage of this law alleged that, quote, 99 out of every 100 Negro women, end quote, abused cocaine. Beyond subjecting Black people in the city to even more institutional scrutiny, the law had immense ramifications on the powers of city government and worked to distinguish city policing efforts from state oversight. On July 11th, 1908, Howard Nelson, a Black man, entered William Rosberg's pharmacy on the 900 block of Frederick Avenue. Nelson asked Rosberg for 6 packs of cocaine. Rosberg obliged and charged Nelson $1.50 for the drugs. Just then, detectives blew through the doors and put Rosberg in handcuffs. The druggist became the most high-profile victim of Swan's cocaine ordinance. The criminal court charged Rosberg with 9 cocaine violations, including selling without a prescription and possession. Rosberg did not accept his punishment quietly. His attorneys challenged the ordinance's constitutionality. The Baltimore police was a state agency. I don't think they are anymore as of yesterday. Uh, they enforced state laws. The 1906 state drug law, which Swan found lacking, did not criminalize drug possession and carried laxer fines. Given its excessive penalties and the city police's subordinate position to the state government, Rosberg's attorneys argued that it violated Article 25 of the Maryland Constitution's Declaration of Rights, which protected against excessive fines and cruel treatment. The state's attorney countered that the city's 1898 Home Rule Charter, which was pushed through by those reformers from the beginning of the presentation, provided broad latitude for city officials to legislate in the interest of the public peace. The criminal court sided with the state's attorney. In their decision, the criminal court noted that cities around the country had to contend with issues of urban density, lawlessness, and dysfunction that required harsher penalties and severer measures than statewide legislation could anticipate or adequately enforce. Such considerations often led to the vestment of broader authority in the municipal corporation. This dynamic constituted a central feature of the so-called police power, which the court described as general in terms but very ample. Rather than provide precise parameters of such a broad and undefinable concept, the court characterized the police power as any measure taken to ensure the safety, health, and good morals of a community. Given an infinite number of perspectives, this definition functionally included any and every measure a city could take. To sketch the contours of the police power, the court invoked the standard of reasonableness. While the police power provided broad and seemingly limitless power, the intention behind its vestment presumed that local government would not invoke the police power oppressively or unreasonably, an absurd assumption to make. And that's just me editorializing. They didn't say that. When applied to cocaine possession, the court found Swan's ordinance eminently reasonable. Statutes in Maryland and around the country made possession of paraphernalia like lottery tickets, oysters, gill nets, or some of the things they cited, illegal. On these grounds, the criminal court and later the Court of Appeals, which was renamed yesterday to the Supreme Court of Maryland, I think, upheld the constitutionality of the ordinance. The court sentenced Rosberg to 1 day in jail and assessed the pharmacist a $100 fine. The court's decision reportedly elated Commissioner Swan and the police marshal. They plan to immediately apply the precedent to regulate the possession of other dangerous and illegal objects, including razors and guns. State's Attorney Owens applauded the decision for allowing the city broader latitude in the exercise of home rule, particularly when the General Assembly was out of session. He noted, quote, "The decision is of value as it establishes the right of the city to absolute home rule on all matters of police regulations," end quote. The decision was not only a coup for the police department, it also provided segregationists with a new tool in the fight for racial zoning. In upholding the cocaine ordinance, the court affirmed the city's broad power and duty to mediate urban conflict. Chief among these conflicts was where people lived. Milton Dashiell, who was infamous for drafting the first residential segregation ordinance that passed in 1910, frequently referenced the Rosberg decision while campaigning for that passage of the residential segregation law. To conclude, the police power symbolized an imprecise and contested terrain of urban governance, As the War of Southern Aggression ended and as municipal corporations morphed into modern U.S. metropolises, the maintenance of order remained a central preoccupation. Several public and private groups had skin in the game. In their efforts to articulate and address urban social issues, the welfare of society revealed a not so thinly veiled investment in white heteropatriarchal values that positioned the poor, destitute, non-white, and criminal as the quote unquote problem that modern municipal structures strove to solve. Solutions emerged in the form of jails, asylums, patrolmen, private detectives, reformers, judges, juries, and boards that created, punished, reproduced, and worsened the very problems they were invented to eradicate. Thank you.
That was great. That was great. I open it up now to questions. Um, People are welcome to put their questions in chat or use audio. I'll start. Michael, what sparked your interest in this, and particularly like this is so focused on Baltimore? Are you from Baltimore? Is this? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I grew up in Lansdowne actually, like right there. And so I I actually started writing this as part of my dissertation. I moved back to the city. I was at graduate school in DC for a couple of years. Moved back to the city and started to do community organizing around housing justice. And the just unmanageable web of bureaucracy that sort of emerged and made that work seemingly impossible, caused me as a sort of researcher to wonder how the sort of state of affairs came to be. Um, and through reading, I understood this period was an important period in articulating like the contours of the American city and establishing a lot of the sort of bureaucratic structures that would be sort of further emboldened during the New Deal and things like that. And also as I was writing it, the uprising happened, and so I was wondering what the relationship between policing and that was, and turns out the relationship was very deeply intertwined and co-constitutive. So that's kind of where it came from.
Mike, can you talk a little bit more about your process, like how you find all of these archival documents and how you kind of like start to piece this story together?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this stuff had been written about in some form. Um, but it's strange, the historiography of Baltimore being this sort of like important city in the sort of the racial history of the United States, and being a the NAACP flourished here, and it was a state that had the sort of largest proportion of freedmen in it. Maryland was. Um, there's not a ton of uh, history of how sort of Black life figured into the city, at least not in these sort of broader historiographies. And so James Crooks wrote a book in 1961 about this election. And so I went back and I went through and realized that the police had a major impact on this, and that particularly the role of the Black electorate was incredibly pronounced, but that hadn't been written about. And so I'm just curious to fill in gaps. Charles Bonaparte was like an incredibly important figure in not just the history of Baltimore City, but also in the history of the country. I mean, he was the Attorney General. He was foundational in the establishment of the FBI. Um, and with the exception of like a Maryland Historical Magazine article on him, I haven't found much about him. And so, yeah, it's a kind of one thing leads to the other, and I'm interested in finding out sort of new things. And also, I I stumble onto things that shouldn't be where they are too. Like the Rossberg decision, the lower court decision from the criminal court was in his indictment file that was in the criminal papers at the Maryland State Archives. I was not even looking for it. I just kind of found it. Um, and so that's the other part of the research process. That day, this is nothing of nothing. That day, I found I was looking through a docket of the Baltimore police had a boat that did sort of like harbor patrol, and they kept a log of things. And that day, I found that the captain of the harbor patrol had left his kidney stones in an envelope inside that uh, booklet, and it was horrifying. Um, so, yeah. Okay. Thank you for the present. I really enjoy listening to this from also as well. Okay. Thanks, James. Could you tell us where you studied and why you chose this field? I studied at the University of Maryland, College Park. I got my PhD in American Studies. I also got my BA there, so I was there for a really long time. Yeah, and I chose this field just given sort of my um, personal history. It was very, um, yeah, pressing and personal to me. Key books about the history of Baltimore, and there were a lot, and there are a lot recently too. I would highly recommend. Katie Hemphill wrote a book called Body City about um, the history of sex work in Baltimore from like 1760 to 1950. It's this grand spanning history. Adam Malka wrote a book called The Men of Mobtown, which is a fantastic history of the police in the immediate pre and post Civil War period. I think Matthew Prenson's book is really good. Baltimore Political History. Um, Dennis Halpin wrote a book recently called A Brotherhood of Liberty that looks at Black activism during the late 19th century and early 20th century, so around this period, which is really good. Um, yeah, there's a lot of new stuff coming out, which is heartening. Also, Steam City by David Schley that came out um, on the University of Chicago Press, I think maybe this year or last year, which is a history of railroads in the city, is also fantastic. I don't know if people are as geeked as I am about reading about railroads. Um, yeah, definitely a lot of contemporary parallels. Yeah, great question, Kevin. And I saw the YouTube video of your presentation, which was really fascinating too. It's great work. Um, yeah, so I'm trying to take methodologically bottom up sort of approach to broader institutional dynamics. Um, there is a lot of there are a lot of ways where sort of like micro historical methods are really useful, like genealogical methods and things like that, that um, allow me to sort of capture more sort of micro dynamics, like intensely felt and lived dynamics in people who encountered these broader systems, um, and also people who are integral in the construction of these broader systems. And so I do like to work from the inside out rather than the outside in, rather than sort of pro- providing sort of like generalized, uh, largely summary understanding of these sort of historical periods. I prefer to understand how people's sort of quotidian and everyday life speaks to and allows us to understand these sort of broader dynamics. Lindsay, archives are gross, but the one you run is very clean. I've never found a tooth or a disgusting thing.
When you were giving your presentation, so much of what you were saying sounded very similar to how Bill Clinton ran his administration of, being tough on crimes and then passing the I forgot what the bill was called, but the one that caused massive prison incarceration. And it just seems like it's the same thing happening over and over again. It's the same play of playbook, basically.
Yeah, yeah, and to connect that back to Charlotte's question too, there's also like it's difficult to do this type of archival work when so many people are lying about stuff, and you don't have like the entree to go in and figure that out. But it was that sort of like this mass demonization that led to this sort of momentous piece of legislation that was built on a fabrication, which it requires engagement of so many different archives, but also doesn't lead to many satisfying answers. Like I can't really, I can guess, but I can't really articulate why there was so much press coverage specifically about Black women in Baltimore City. And after this law was passed, virtually none of them were arrested for coke. And that had been the sort of stand. I mean, I know why, but I don't know why. You know what I mean? And so that also becomes a sort of conundrum when you're doing this. Um, this type of work where so much of it is are the police lying? And the answer almost 100% of the time is yes.
Any more questions? Then with that, thank you. This was a wonderful presentation. Thank you everyone for attending. Tomorrow I will be sending a copy of this recording and hope to see you in the sort of remaining symposium lectures. But have a safe day, everybody.
Thanks for coming, everybody.